The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Virginia City Bank and Trust, where Matthew Harris hunched over his ledger, meticulously recording the day's transactions. The newly constructed bank stood proudly on the bustling riverside, its fresh pine boards and gleaming brass fixtures a testament to the prosperity brought by the recent gold strikes in the territory. But beneath the polished surface, Matthew had begun to notice disturbing patterns in the accounts he maintained for his employer, John Wright. Matthew's quill scratched across the paper as he traced another suspicious transfer. $500 moved from the orphanage fund to an unnamed mining operation. His fingers trembled slightly as he compared the dates to previous transactions. Over the past 6 months, funds had been steadily disappearing from the orphanage accounts, always following the arrival of new children and always ending up in the same mysterious mining venture. The sound of boots on the wooden walkway outside made Matthew hastily close the ledger. John Wright swept into the bank, his expensive suit dusty from riding. Behind him came David Young, the territorial mine inspector whose visits had grown more frequent lately. The two men barely acknowledged Matthew as they disappeared into Wright's private office, their hushed voices carrying an urgency that made the young clerk's skin prickle with unease. Through the frosted glass of Wright's office door, Matthew could make out the men's silhouettes gesturing animatedly. A name caught his ear. King, referring to Michael King, the territorial governor who had appointed Young to his position just months ago. Matthew had seen the governor's signature on documents authorizing new mining claims, including several that seemed connected to the missing orphanage funds. As darkness crept over Virginia City, Matthew remained at his desk, pretending to work while the meeting in Wright's office continued. His mind wandered to the children he'd seen arriving at the orphanage. Thin, frightened faces peering from wagons before being hustled inside by the stern matron, Grace Lewis. Some of those same children had later disappeared, supposedly adopted by families seeking workers for their farms. But Matthew had never seen any adoption papers cross his desk. The crack of Wright's door opening startled Matthew from his thoughts. As Young departed, Wright approached Matthew's desk, his usual confident swagger somewhat diminished. "Harris, I need you to prepare transfer documents for tomorrow. The orphanage is sending more workers. More children are being placed with families." Wright's slip made Matthew's blood run cold, but he nodded dutifully while his mind raced. That night, unable to sleep, Matthew paced his small rented room above the general store. The pieces were falling into place, the missing funds, the disappearing children, the connection to the mines. But proving it would be dangerous. Wright's influence extended throughout Virginia City, and Governor King's involvement meant even territorial authorities couldn't be trusted. Matthew needed help, but who could he turn to? Dawn found Matthew walking along the riverbank, trying to clear his head. Movement caught his eye. A woman in a mix of native and settler clothing watching him intently from the shadow of a cottonwood tree. She stepped forward, revealing striking features and eyes that held both wisdom and pain. "You've seen them take the children," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am Hannah. 2 moons ago, they took mine." Hannah's story poured out in a quiet voice that trembled with controlled fury. Her 2 young sons had been seized by the territorial authorities, declared orphans despite her protests, and taken to Grace Lewis's orphanage. When Hannah had tried to reclaim them, she was threatened with arrest. Now they were gone, supposedly adopted. But Hannah had tracked them to one of Wright's mines in the hills. "The mines are death traps," Hannah explained, her hands clenching. "They send children into spaces too small for men, forcing them to dig in unstable tunnels. Many do not return." She fixed Matthew with an intense gaze. "You have proof in your numbers, don't you? Help me expose this evil, or more children will die in the dark while men like Wright grow rich on gold stained with innocent blood." Matthew struggled with the weight of the decision before him. Helping Hannah meant risking everything: his job, his safety, possibly his life. But the alternative was becoming complicit in an atrocity. Looking into Hannah's determined eyes, he made his choice. "We'll need more evidence," he said, "and we'll have to be careful. Wright has friends in high places." Hannah nodded grimly. "I have friends too," she replied. "Some who remember when justice meant more than gold." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Virginia City's muddy streets as Matthew and Hannah made their way toward the river docks. The warehouses there would provide cover while they planned their next move. Matthew's ledger, tucked securely inside his coat, felt heavier with each step as he considered the damning evidence it contained. Carefully coded entries tracking Wright's transactions with the orphanage and suspicious payments to mining operations. Hannah moved with the silent grace of someone accustomed to avoiding notice, guiding them through narrow alleys between weather-worn buildings. The spring air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke and river mud, along with the constant clamor of steamboat whistles and wagon wheels on wooden planks. Matthew found himself studying his unlikely ally, noting how she seamlessly blended traditional native dress with practical frontier clothing, a silent statement of someone walking between two worlds. Wright keeps additional records in his private office, Matthew whispered, as they ducked behind a stack of cotton bales. Every Friday, he meets with a man named David who brings reports from the mines. I've seen them exchanging documents, but they're careful to keep them locked away. Hannah's eyes narrowed at this information, her fingers unconsciously touching the beaded medicine pouch at her waist. David is known to my people, she replied, voice tight with controlled anger. He recruits children from other territories as well, promising their families good wages and education in Virginia City. Instead, they disappear into the mines. She pulled a worn map from her satchel, pointing to locations along the river where mining operations had sprung up in the past year. The sound of approaching boots sent them deeper into the shadows. Two of Wright's men passed nearby, discussing preparations for a shipment heading upriver to Amarillo. Matthew held his breath until their voices faded, then turned back to Hannah. We need to get into that office before Friday's meeting. If we can copy those documents, we'll have proof of the whole operation. Hannah studied the warehouse across the street, her expression thoughtful. There is a way, she said slowly. But it will require help from someone else who has lost children to Wright's schemes. She explained that a woman named Grace worked as a cleaning woman in Wright's building, maintaining access to most rooms after hours. Her son was taken 6 months ago. She has been searching, but feared moving against Wright alone. The plan began taking shape as dusk settled over the river. Matthew would continue his normal routine at the bank, watching for patterns in Wright's movements. Hannah would make contact with Grace and other parents whose children had vanished, building a network of allies. Most crucially, they needed to find a way to get word to the children themselves, to prepare them for eventual rescue. Victoria runs a legitimate orphanage in Santa Fe, Hannah explained. She can provide safe haven once we free them. But first, we must break Wright's hold on local law enforcement. She pulled out another document, this one bearing an official territorial seal. This letter proves the governor's office has been accepting regular donations from Wright's mining interests. If we expose this corruption, his protection disappears. Matthew stared at the evidence of how deep the conspiracy reached. His own comfortable life seemed insignificant compared to the suffering of so many innocent children. We'll need to move carefully, he cautioned. If Wright suspects anything, he might send the children deeper into the mining system where we can't reach them. Hannah's face hardened with determination. Then we make our first move tomorrow night. Grace will let us into the building after sunset. While you search Wright's office, I will check his house. He keeps a journal. My sources say it contains details of every transaction. She touched Matthew's arm gently. Are you certain you want to continue? There is no shame in walking away. Matthew thought of the children working in darkness, of Hannah's quiet strength, of his own responsibility to fight injustice when he found it. I'm certain, he replied. Whatever happens, we see this through. The river rolled past in the gathering darkness, its waters carrying secrets downstream toward Laredo and beyond. Tomorrow would begin their real fight against Wright's empire of greed and suffering. The next evening arrived with an unseasonal chill, the river's mist clinging to Matthew's boots as he made his way through Virginia City's muddy streets toward the bank. The gas lamps cast eerie shadows against the weathered buildings, their yellow light barely penetrating the thick fog rolling in from the water. His heart pounded against his ribs, knowing that tonight's actions would irreversibly set him on a path from which there could be no return. Grace met him at the bank's side entrance, her normally cheerful face drawn with worry. Mr. Wright left for Santa Fe this morning, she whispered, hands trembling as she passed him the spare key. But his new assistant, Michael, has been in the office all afternoon sorting through documents. I haven't seen him leave. Matthew nodded grimly, remembering how Wright had hired Michael just 2 weeks prior. another piece in his expanding network of corruption. Inside, the bank's familiar corridors felt different in the darkness, transformed into something sinister by shadows and silence. Matthew Harris pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the Virginia City bank vault, heart-pounding as he overheard his employer John Wright discussing the shipment with David King, the mine owner. Through the crack in the heavy iron door, he watched Wright count out stacks of gold coins, payment for 12 orphaned children to work King's new shaft at the Devil's Gulch mine. Matthew's fingers trembled as he recorded each terrible detail in his small leather notebook, knowing this evidence could send both men to prison. The autumn wind howled through Virginia City's muddy streets as Matthew hurried toward the territorial governor's office, clutching his damning evidence. His mind raced with the faces of those children he'd seen loaded onto wagons in the dead of night, their eyes hollow with fear. But before he could reach the granite steps of the government building, two of King's men intercepted him, their grins promising violence. "Mr. Wright would like a word about your after-hours activities," the taller one sneered. That evening found Matthew nursing bruised ribs in the back room of Grace's Mercantile, where his childhood friend Grace Young tended his wounds. "The governor won't help," she whispered, pressing a cold cloth to his swollen jaw. "Michael Lewis tried exposing the scheme last year. They found him face down in the Carson River." Her words confirmed Matthew's growing suspicion. This conspiracy reached to the highest levels of territorial government. But he couldn't let it continue, not with more orphans arriving on tomorrow's riverboat. As Grace wrapped his ribs, a shadow fell across the doorway. There stood a Native American woman, her dark eyes intense with purpose. She introduced herself as Hannah, explaining in perfect English that two of her children had been stolen and sold to the mines. She'd tracked them for months, following the trail of Wright's operation across 3 territories. "You are not alone in this fight," she told Matthew, "but we must move carefully. The river holds many secrets, and I know where the bodies are buried." In the following days, Matthew and Hannah formed an unlikely alliance, sharing information and resources. She taught him to move silently through the shadows of Virginia City's warehouse district, where they documented the arrival of more orphans. He provided access to bank records, showing the flow of blood money between Wright, King, and the governor's office. Together, they pieced together a complex web of corruption that stretched from Santa Fe to Laredo. Hannah's knowledge of the river trading routes proved invaluable. She had spent years working as a translator between tribes and merchants, learning the rhythms of commerce along the waterways. Through her connections, they discovered Wright was using legitimate trade vessels to transport children, hiding them among cargo bound for mining camps. The brutal efficiency of the operation made Matthew's blood run cold. These weren't just criminals. They were businessmen treating human lives as commodities. Their investigation led them to Rebecca Lewis, Michael's widow, who had maintained her husband's detailed records of the conspiracy. Hidden in her root cellar lay ledgers documenting 5 years of child trafficking, including names, dates, and burial sites. "Michael knew they'd kill him," Rebecca explained, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "He made copies of everything. I've been waiting for someone brave enough to finish what he started." As Matthew and Hannah pored over the ledgers by lamplight, a pattern emerged. The operation wasn't just about cheap labor for the mines. It was part of a larger scheme to control the region's gold production. By staffing the most dangerous shafts with expendable children, Wright and his associates could exploit deadly veins that adult miners refused to work. The territory's remarkable gold output, it seemed, was built on the bones of the innocent. The breakthrough came when they identified Andrew Young, Grace's brother, as a sympathetic guard at the governor's mansion. Through him, they learned of an upcoming meeting between Wright, King, and the governor to expand their operation. But as they formulated a plan to gather evidence, Matthew noticed unfamiliar men watching the bank. Hannah's sources reported increased activity along the river. Their window of opportunity was closing, and their enemies were circling ever closer. The evening river mist clung to Virginia City's waterfront as Matthew and Hannah made their way to the arranged meeting with Andrew Young. The abandoned warehouse's weathered boards creaked beneath their feet, the sound mixing with distant paddle wheel splashes and the mournful whistle of a passing steamboat. Hannah's traditional medicine pouch, worn beneath her shawl, tapped softly against her side with each careful step. Through the gaps in the planking, they could see torchlit boats moving along the river, Wright's men expanding their patrols. The air was thick with tension and the metallic taste of approaching rain. Andrew's information had to be worth the risk they were taking by meeting so close to the governor's mansion, where the conspiracy's heart beat strongest. "They're moving the children tomorrow night," Andrew whispered when they found him hiding behind stacked crates. His guard's uniform was dirty, suggesting he'd taken a circuitous route to avoid detection. 3 wagons headed for the new shaft at Broken Ridge. Wright's getting desperate. The main veins are playing out and he needs fresh workers for the dangerous sections. Hannah's fingers tightened around her medicine pouch. "My son could be among them," she said, her voice carrying the weight of months of searching. "The governor's men took him from our camp during the last raid. He would be 12 now." Matthew noticed how she squared her shoulders, strength flowing through grief like a river through rocky rapids. The warehouse's shadows shifted as clouds passed over the moon. Andrew produced a crumpled map showing the convoy's route. "They'll follow the old trading path through Shadow Canyon. It's the only way to move wagons without being seen from the main road." His hands trembled as he traced the route. But Wright's not taking chances. He's hired extra guns, professional killers from Santa Fe. Matthew studied the map's faded lines, his banker's mind calculating distances and timing. "We'll need help," he said. "The territorial marshal in Laredo owes me a favor, but it's 3 days' ride." Hannah shook her head, her dark eyes reflecting the distant torchlight. "The children cannot wait that long. Some are already sick from the mine dust. My people have warriors who will help, but they must know their fight is just." A sudden commotion outside sent them diving behind the crates. Heavy boots thudded on the dock, and rough voices called out search patterns. Wright's men were expanding their patrol route. Andrew's absence from his post had been noticed. They huddled in silence as lantern lights swept through the warehouse's gaps, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny gold flakes. When the danger passed, they emerged to find their options narrowing like the tributary streams feeding the main river. "There's a forgotten mine shaft," Andrew offered, his voice barely audible. "It connects to the new workings where they'll take the children. The entrance is hidden in Bear Creek Valley. If we can get there first." He left the possibility hanging in the damp air. Hannah pulled a small leather pouch from her medicine bag. "My people know those caves. They hold sacred places older than any mine." She sprinkled something that smelled of sage and cedar on the warehouse floor. "The spirits of the earth will guide us, but we must move quickly. Tonight's moon is waning. Soon darkness will be our only shield." Matthew felt the weight of his ledger books filled with damning evidence, pressing against his chest where he'd hidden them. The comfortable life he'd known as a bank clerk seemed as insubstantial as morning mist now. Before him stretched a path as dangerous as any mine shaft, but lined with something more precious than gold. The chance to save innocent lives and expose a corruption that ran deeper than any vein of ore. They parted ways in the growing darkness, each with tasks to complete before tomorrow's confrontation. Hannah to gather her warriors, Andrew to return to his post with a believable story, and Matthew to secure the evidence where Wright couldn't destroy it. The river rolled on beneath the stars, its current carrying secrets as dark as its depths, while above, thunder growled like distant dynamite blasts from the mines that had started it all. Dawn found Matthew in the cramped back room of Victoria's general store in Virginia City, his hands trembling as he transferred the damning ledger entries to fresh paper. The store owner, a widow who'd lost her husband to a mine collapse 2 years prior, kept watch at the window while sorting inventory. A believable cover should Wright's men come sniffing around. The scratching of Matthew's pen seemed deafening in the tense silence, each number a nail in the coffin he was building for his former employer. Through the store's grimy windows, he watched miners trudging toward the shaft entrances, their shadows long in the morning light. Among them were children, some no taller than his waist, their thin shoulders already bent with the weight of picks and shovels. His stomach churned, remembering how Wright had called them apprentices in the books, coding their purchase prices as training fees and placement costs. Hannah's words from the previous night echoed in his mind as he worked. She'd spoken of following the river south to Amarillo, where her tribal contacts could shelter them while they gathered more evidence. The thought of leaving everything behind terrified him, but the alternative, staying silent while more children disappeared into the mines, was unthinkable. Victoria had agreed to help smuggle the documents out in shipments of dry goods, hiding them among invoices and supply lists. A commotion in the street drew Matthew to the window. John Wright's carriage was pulling up outside the bank, the mine owner's rotund figure emerging like a bloated spider from its web. The thundering hooves echoed through the narrow canyon as Matthew Harris pushed his horse harder, ducking low against its neck as bullets whizzed past. Behind him, John King's men were gaining ground, their shouts carrying on the wind. The bank ledgers tucked inside Matthew's coat held the damning evidence. Hundreds of transactions showing how King had been laundering money from the child trafficking operation through the Virginia City Bank and Trust. But Matthew knew the papers alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to reach Rebecca Whitecloud before King's men caught up to him. Rebecca's warnings about the scope of the conspiracy had seemed impossible at first. But after discovering his own bank manager was helping territorial officials hide their profits from selling orphaned children to the mining companies, Matthew had been forced to accept the horrifying truth. The entire system was corrupted, from the orphanage directors to Governor Young himself. Only Rebecca, searching tirelessly for her stolen children, had been willing to help him expose it all. The canyon walls fell away as Matthew burst out onto the floodplain along the Missouri River. Trading posts and warehouses dotted the muddy shoreline, weathered structures that had seen decades of commerce flowing up and down the Great Waterway. He spotted Rebecca's signal, 3 quick flashes of light from the window of an abandoned riverboat casino moored against the bank. She had found something important in the cargo manifests, something that would help them prove where the children were being sent. But before Matthew could reach the riverboat, shots rang out from the trading post rooftops. King's men had split up to cut him off. A bullet clipped his shoulder, nearly unseating him. Blood spread across his shirt as he wheeled his horse toward the only escape route left, straight into the swift brown waters of the Missouri. The spring floods had turned the river treacherous, but Matthew had no choice. He dug his heels in, and his horse plunged forward into the current. The shock of the cold water stole his breath as the current swept them downstream. His horse fought to keep its head above water as Matthew clung to its mane with one hand, desperately trying to keep the precious ledgers dry with the other. The shouts of King's men grew distant, but Matthew knew they would be waiting at every ford and crossing for miles. His only hope was to reach the Lakota camp, where Rebecca's people had offered them sanctuary. Inside the riverboat, Rebecca crouched in the shadows as boots thundered across the deck above. She clutched the cargo manifest that detailed shipments of mining equipment to camps deep in the Black Hills, camps that didn't exist in any official records. The manifests were signed by Michael Wright, King's partner in the Virginia City Bank. But more importantly, they were countersigned by Governor Young himself. Finally, they had proof of his direct involvement. Through a gap in the worn planks, Rebecca caught glimpses of King's men spreading out along the shore, scanning the churning waters for any sign of Matthew. Her heart clenched with fear for him, but she forced herself to stay hidden. The manifests in her hands were too important. If anything happened to Matthew, she would need them to continue their fight, to find not just her own children, but all the others who had been sold into what amounted to slavery in the mines. As dusk approached, Rebecca slipped from the riverboat and made her way along the shadowy shoreline. She had to reach the rendezvous point before nightfall. Matthew would be waiting there. He had to be. They had come too far, risked too much to fail now. The faces of her children drove her forward through the gathering darkness, Sarah and Thomas. 4 years since they were taken. But soon, with Matthew's help and the evidence they had gathered, she would finally bring them home. The Lakota camp was hidden in a sheltered valley 3 miles upriver. As Rebecca approached, she saw Grace Whitecloud, her sister, waiting anxiously at the edge of the firelight. But there was no sign of Matthew. Grace's face was grave as she hurried forward to meet her. "King's men are everywhere," she whispered. "They're watching all the crossing points. If your friend tried to swim the river..." She didn't need to finish. They both knew how dangerous the spring floods could be. Rebecca refused to give up hope. Matthew was smart and determined. He would find a way to reach them. He had to. The ledgers he carried were essential to proving the governor's corruption. Without them, the manifest she had found would not be enough. As she huddled with Grace around the fire, Rebecca sent up silent prayers to the spirits of her ancestors. "Watch over him," she pleaded. "Guide him safely through the darkness." Their fight for justice was not yet over. The night grew deeper as Rebecca and Grace kept their vigil. Other members of the tribe brought them food and blankets, but Rebecca could not eat. Her thoughts were consumed with worry for Matthew and memories of her children. She had not told him the full truth, that Sarah and Thomas were not her only motivation for fighting King's operation. She had discovered that dozens of Lakota children had been taken over the years, torn from their families just as hers had been. A commotion at the edge of camp snapped Rebecca from her dark thoughts. Shouts of alarm were quickly followed by calls for help. She ran toward the river, heart pounding. Through the gloom, she made out several figures supporting someone who stumbled between them, dripping wet and barely conscious. Matthew. He was alive. Relief flooded through her as she rushed to help him, but her joy turned to ice when she saw his face. Something was terribly wrong. "The ledgers," Matthew gasped as they eased him down by the fire. "I lost them in the river. I'm sorry, Rebecca. I tried to hold on, but the current." He broke into a fit of coughing, his clothes soaked and muddy. Rebecca gripped his hand, fighting back tears of frustration. Without those records, they had no direct proof of the bank's involvement. King and Wright would claim the manifests were forged. The governor would continue to protect them. All their work, all their sacrifices, had been for nothing. But as Matthew's coughing subsided, a fierce light entered his eyes. "There's another way," he said hoarsely. "I memorized the ledgers before I took them. Every transaction, every name and date. I can recreate them from memory. It won't be as good as the originals, but with your manifests..." Hope sparked in Rebecca's chest. It wasn't over. They still had a chance to expose the truth and save the children. But first, they had to survive the night. King's men were still out there, and they wouldn't stop hunting until they were silenced forever. Thunder rumbled across the dark sky as Matthew and Rebecca huddled in the abandoned trading post on the outskirts of Virginia City. The wooden walls creaked under the assault of wind and rain, but they offered precious shelter while Matthew, still shivering, began meticulously recreating the ledgers from memory. Rebecca kept watch through a crack in the boarded windows, her father's old rifle across her lap, watching for the telltale lantern light of King's men searching the riverbank. As dawn approached, Matthew's hand cramped from hours of writing, but determination drove him forward. Each entry he recorded was another nail in King's coffin. Dates, amounts, falsified documents showing orphaned children being transferred to mining companies for pennies on the dollar. Rebecca recognized several names from her own tribe's missing children. The truth was there in black and white. A damning web of corruption stretching from Virginia City to the territorial governor's mansion in Santa Fe. A horse's whinny pierced the pre-dawn silence. Rebecca's grip tightened on her rifle as shadows moved through the mist. "They're coming," she whispered. "At least 6 men." Matthew gathered the freshly written pages, hands trembling but voice steady. "There's a cellar door behind that barrel. If we can reach the tunnel..." A bullet splintered the window frame, and Rebecca returned fire, forcing their attackers to scatter for cover. The air filled with gun smoke and shouts as King's men laid siege to the trading post. Rebecca's careful shots kept them at bay, while Matthew worked frantically to pry open the rusted cellar door. Finally, it gave way with a grinding shriek. But as they prepared to escape, a familiar voice called out from the darkness. "It's over, Matthew. Be reasonable." It was David Wright, the bank president himself, come to ensure their silence. Rebecca's heart pounded as she saw Matthew hesitate, years of conditioning to respect authority warring with his conscience. "They're just children," he said finally, voice breaking. "How could you?" Wright's answer was another volley of bullets. As they scrambled down the cellar steps, Rebecca caught a glimpse of Wright's face in the growing light. Not anger, but fear. They had him, and he knew it. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to crawl through thick mud and standing water. Rebecca led the way, having used these old trading routes before. Behind them, boots thundered on floorboards as King's men discovered their escape. The sound of axes splintering wood echoed through the passage. They were breaking through to the cellar. Matthew clutched the precious documents to his chest, protecting them from the wet and filth. They emerged half a mile away in a grove of cottonwoods by the river. Rebecca knew they had to split up. She would draw their pursuers north while Matthew made for Laredo with the evidence. But as she turned to explain the plan, she saw Matthew's face change. "Look," he breathed, pointing downstream. Through the lifting fog, they saw a riverboat approaching, the stars and stripes snapping in the wind. The federal marshal's quarterly inspection tour, right on schedule. Rebecca smiled grimly as understanding dawned. King and Wright had been so focused on local control, they'd forgotten about federal authority. With witnesses arriving and documented proof in hand, their carefully constructed empire of corruption would crumble. The children would be freed, families reunited. Justice, so long denied, was finally within reach. A shout from the trees reminded them they weren't safe yet. Rebecca chambered another round as Matthew began signaling the approaching riverboat. The next few minutes would determine everything: their lives, their cause, the fate of countless innocent children. Behind them, King's men were closing in. Ahead lay salvation if they could only hold out a little longer. Rebecca took careful aim at the tree line, ready to make every shot count. The sun broke through the clouds as the riverboat's whistle split the morning air. Rebecca saw fear ripple through their pursuers, Wright and his men melting back into the shadows as federal authority approached. She kept her rifle trained on the trees until the boat was close enough to see the marshal on deck, responding to Matthew's frantic signals. Only then did she lower her weapon, exhaustion and relief washing over her in equal measure. As dawn broke over Virginia City, Matthew Harris stood at the entrance of the abandoned Crown Point mine, his heart pounding. Behind him, Rebecca White Eagle notched an arrow while scanning the tree line. They had tracked the children here after discovering ledgers in David Wright's office detailing years of human trafficking, masked as labor contracts. The territorial governor's signature appeared on every document, each child's fate sealed with official ink and wax. The sound of pickaxes echoed from deep within the mine shaft. Matthew's hands trembled as he checked his borrowed revolver one final time. Rebecca had taught him to shoot over the past weeks, but his banker's fingers still felt clumsy on the trigger. The weight of what they'd discovered, dozens of orphaned children sold into virtual slavery, pressed down on him like the mountain itself. "There are guards posted at the lower entrance," Rebecca whispered, her dark eyes never leaving the surrounding forest. 3 men, all armed. She had lost her own children to Wright's scheme 2 years ago, their names buried in those damning ledgers. Her tracking skills and knowledge of the territory had kept them alive since fleeing Virginia City, always one step ahead of Wright's hired guns. The plan was simple but dangerous. While Rebecca created a distraction at the lower entrance, Matthew would lead the children out through this abandoned shaft. They had a string of horses waiting in a hidden canyon and sympathetic families ready to shelter the children all along the river route to Santa Fe. If they succeeded, Wright's entire operation would crumble. Thunder rolled across the valley as storm clouds gathered. Matthew remembered that terrible night 3 weeks ago when he'd first stumbled upon Wright's secret. Working late at the bank, he'd heard crying from the basement strongroom. Investigation revealed 5 terrified children locked inside, waiting to be transferred to the mines. That discovery had shattered his orderly world forever. Rebecca touched his arm, pulling him back to the present. "It's time," she said softly. "The storm will cover our movements." She pressed something into his hand, a small leather pouch containing sacred herbs. "For protection," she explained. "My people believe they guard against evil spirits. Today, we fight a very real evil." Her quiet strength steadied him as she melted into the shadows. Gunfire erupted from the lower entrance, accompanied by shouts of alarm. Rebecca's diversion had begun. Matthew slipped into the mine shaft, following the sound of children's voices. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to crouch as he moved deeper into the mountain's heart. Ahead, lamplight flickered against rough-hewn walls. He found them in a large chamber, 23 children wielding picks and shovels under the watchful eyes of 2 armed guards. Matthew recognized John King, Wright's head enforcer, giving orders in his characteristic growl. The other guard was Andrew Lewis, a former deputy sheriff who'd chosen profit over justice. What happened next unfolded like a fever dream. Rebecca's arrows found both guards before they could react, silent death from the shadows. As King fell, he managed one wild shot that kicked up stone chips near Matthew's head. The children dropped their tools and huddled together, wide-eyed with fear and hope. Matthew recognized the youngest ones from that night in the bank vault. Leading them out proved harder than expected. The children were weak from months of forced labor, and the youngest needed to be carried. Thunder crashed overhead as they emerged into driving rain. Rebecca appeared like a spirit, helping to organize their escape. They had almost reached the hidden canyon when horses approached from Virginia City, Wright himself leading a posse of hired guns. "Take them," Rebecca commanded, pushing Matthew toward the canyon trail. "I'll hold them here." Before he could protest, she had vanished into the storm, her bow singing death among Wright's men. Matthew hurried the children along the narrow path, trying to block out the sounds of fighting behind them. Rebecca had prepared this route well. Even in the rain, they couldn't lose their way. Hours later, they huddled in an abandoned trading post along the river, waiting for their escorts to Santa Fe. The children slept, finally safe. Matthew kept watch at the window, sick with worry about Rebecca. Dawn was approaching when she appeared, soaked and limping but alive. Her arrows had found several marks, including David Wright himself. "The territorial governor will send more men," she said, cleaning a shallow wound on her arm. "But the evidence is already on its way to Washington. Wright's ledgers will destroy them all." She smiled for the first time since Matthew had known her. "My children were among the first he took. Now they will be among the last he ever steals." The story broke like a thunderclap across the territory. Wright's death opened floodgates of testimony. The governor resigned in disgrace. Families were reunited. Matthew found himself appointed the new bank manager, using his position to help those affected by Wright's crimes. Rebecca located her children in a mine near Laredo, bringing them home to begin healing. Years later, Matthew often thought about that rain-soaked night, about courage and justice and the unlikely partnership that had exposed such terrible crimes. Rebecca remained his friend, teaching him her people's ways while he helped her navigate the white man's world of business and law. Together they had written a new chapter in the territory's history, one of redemption rather than greed. The Crown Point mine was sealed, its dark secrets buried forever. But the lessons learned there lived on, passed down through generations. Matthew never forgot Rebecca's words that morning. "Evil thrives in shadow. Our duty is to bring it into the light." In time, their story became legend. The banker and the warrior who had saved the children of Virginia City, proving that justice could bloom even in gold-poisoned soil. A decade after the Crown Point mine scandal, Matthew found himself standing before the Virginia City Council, advocating for a memorial to honor the children who had suffered. The marble monument would stand in the town square, its inscription a testament to both tragedy and triumph. Rebecca sat in the front row, her grown children beside her, their faces reflecting the quiet dignity that had become their family's hallmark. The town had changed dramatically since those dark days. Where greed once ruled, community now flourished. The old bank building had been transformed into a school for native and settler children alike, its vault converted to a library where Rebecca taught traditional medicine alongside modern subjects. Matthew's role as bank manager had expanded to include oversight of a trust fund for indigenous education, funded by the seized assets of those who had once profited from exploitation. In Santa Fe, the territorial governor's mansion stood empty, its previous occupant serving time in a federal prison. The investigation had rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone, exposing corruption in Amarillo and beyond. Some conspirators had fled, others faced justice, but the system that had enabled their crimes had been dismantled piece by piece, replaced by strict regulations and oversight. The partnership between Matthew and Rebecca had inspired others. Along the river trading routes, mixed councils of native and settler leaders now governed commerce, ensuring fair treatment for all. The old prejudices hadn't vanished entirely, but they were fading like morning mist before the sun. Their children played together, learned together, grew together in ways that would have seemed impossible in the days of the mine. Rebecca's healing practice had grown into a proper clinic, combining traditional knowledge with modern medicine. Miners' families still came to her, but now for routine care rather than desperate emergencies. Her oldest son had become a doctor, practicing in Laredo, while her daughter studied law in the East, determined to protect the rights of those who couldn't protect themselves. Matthew's own life had taken unexpected turns. He'd married Hannah, a schoolteacher who shared his passion for justice, and together they'd adopted 3 children orphaned by the mine tragedy. Their home became a gathering place for both communities, where stories were shared and traditions preserved. The nightmares that had once plagued him had faded, replaced by dreams of a future bright with possibility. The river that had once carried gold now carried hope. Hope in the form of legitimate trade, cultural exchange, and growing prosperity for all. The trading posts that dotted its banks were no longer just places of commerce, but centers of community, where different peoples came together in peace. The old wounds were healing, though their scars remained as reminders of what had been overcome. On the anniversary of the mine's closure each year, a ceremony was held. Native drums mingled with church bells, and children released paper lanterns into the night sky, one for each soul lost to greed and corruption. Rebecca would sing the songs of her people, her voice carrying across the water, while Matthew stood silent, remembering those who had given everything for justice. The legend of their partnership had indeed grown, but not in the way of typical Western tales. There were no shootouts to glorify, no simple heroes and villains. Instead, their story was one of moral courage, of crossing boundaries, of choosing right over easy. It was taught in schools now, not as ancient history, but as a living lesson in the power of unity and perseverance. As Matthew watched the council vote unanimously to approve the memorial, he caught Rebecca's eye. They shared a quiet smile, knowing that their work wasn't finished. It never would be. But satisfied that they had helped build something lasting. The children of Virginia City would grow up knowing not just the price of gold, but the far greater value of justice, compassion, and understanding between peoples. The sun set over the river that evening, painting the sky in shades of promise. In the distance, the sealed entrance to Crown Point Mine was barely visible, overgrown with wildflowers, nature's own memorial to transformation and renewal. The territory was changing, growing into something better than its violent past had suggested possible. And in that change, Matthew and Rebecca found their true reward, a future worth fighting for.